History is written by the victors, but sometimes it is shaped by those who were never meant to be seen. It is September 1944. 3 months after D-Day, the Allied war machine is slamming against the borders of the Third Reich. General George S. Patton's Third Army, a spearhead of American armor, is driving hard toward the heart of Germany. But to do this, to launch a new secret offensive, Patton must move his entire army, and in doing so, he will create a vacuum, a gap, a 70-mile stretch of the front line in Luxembourg, left dangerously, suicidally open. If the Germans discover this gap, they will pour through it. They will flank the Third Army, cut off the Allied advance, and potentially change the entire course of the war in Europe. General Omar Bradley, staring at the map, faces an impossible problem. He needs to make 70 miles of empty forest and farmland look like it's occupied by one of the most powerful armies on Earth. He needs a phantom. He needs a miracle. What he gets is something else entirely. He gets the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit so secret its existence is classified top secret. A unit armed not with heavy cannons, but with paintbrushes, not with machine guns, but with giant speakers. This is the untold story of the 1,100 men who were ordered to hold a 70-mile front line. They were artists, sound engineers, architects, and actors. They were the Ghost Army. And this is how they fooled Hitler. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was a regiment of rascals, a collection of creatives plucked from the most unlikely corners of American life. They weren't recruited from West Point. They were scouted from the art schools of New York, the advertising agencies of Madison Avenue, and the radio stations of Philadelphia. Among them was Private Jack Riley, a 20-year-old painter from the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. He was thin, wore glasses, and had hands stained with charcoal, not grease. When he enlisted, he figured they'd have him painting camouflage on trucks, or maybe propaganda posters, loose lips sink ships, that sort of thing. Then he got his orders. 603rd Camouflage Engineers. It sounded about right. But when they shipped him to boot camp, the first question he was asked was, "Can you inflate a tank?" He thought it was a joke. He thought, "Great, I've been assigned to the circus." Then there was Corporal Ben Jacobs, a sound technician from CBS Radio in Chicago. His talent wasn't marksmanship, it was acoustics. He could make a 5-man radio drama sound like a crowd of thousands. His job at the station was sound effects, Foley. He made thunder with sheet metal and footsteps with gravel pits. When the Army found out, they put him in the 31 30-second Signal Service Company. He assumed he'd be fixing radios. Turns out, the Army didn't want him to fix anything. They wanted him to break the silence. They wanted him to perform, to put on the biggest show of the war. Jack and Ben were part of an elaborate 4-part illusion, a traveling road show of deception. The first pillar was Jack's unit, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual artists. Their job was to create the things of war. The second was Ben's unit, the 31 30-second Signal Service Company, the Sonic Wizards. Their job was to create the sound of war. The third pillar was the Signal Company, the spoof radio operators, They were the actors, creating the chatter of war. And the fourth was the 406th Combat Engineers, the special effects and security team. They ran the bulldozers, managed the fake insignias, and, most importantly, carried the real guns. A handful of 50-caliber machine guns, they were the Ghost Army's only real defense if the illusion failed. Their mission was simple: become the divisions they were not. Their canvas was the battlefield, and their audience was the German High Command. The arsenal of the 603rd was one of military history's greatest absurdities. Jack Riley and his fellow artists were given inflatable rubber dummies, M4 Sherman tanks, M7 Priest artillery cannons, P-47 Thunderbolt airplanes. The first time Jack saw one, it was just a pile of rubber. He'd hook up the air compressor, and this thing would groan to life. In 3 minutes, he'd have a 30-ton Sherman tank, except it weighed only 93 pounds. He saw 4 men pick one up and move it. He saw a stiff breeze knock a whole artillery battery on its side. It was surreal. But from 500 feet in the air to a German reconnaissance pilot, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The genius was not just in the objects, but in the performance. This is where the 406th Engineers came in. A tank setting in a field is just a target. A real armored division makes a mess. So the 406th would get the dozers. They'd drive them in circles to carve perfect, believable tank tracks into the mud around the rubber dummies. The 603rd would paint on the correct unit insignias for, say, the 6th Armored Division. They'd even have a few guys set up a fake laundry line or dig a fake latrine. As Jack learned, it's the little details, the human details, that sell the illusion. They weren't just soldiers. They were set designers. But a silent army is a dead army. German intelligence didn't just look for tanks, they listened for them. This is where Corporal Ben Jacobs and his symphony of deception took center stage. Ben's unit was equipped with a secret weapon, a mobile sound system years ahead of its time. Massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of blasting sound up to 15 miles. Their ammunition? A library of sound effects, recorded with obsessive detail back at Fort Knox, Kentucky. They had everything. They had records of infantry battalions marching. They had pontoon bridges being constructed under fire. They had artillery fire, both incoming and outgoing. Ben's personal favorite was Armored Division on the Move. It was a 30-minute loop of pure mechanical chaos. Ben's job was to be a conductor. He and his team would drive their sound trucks into the woods, often just a mile from the German lines, point their speakers toward the enemy, and begin the performance. But you couldn't just play the tank's record, you had to stage it. Ben would start the sound low. The division is approaching. Then, an hour later, he'd fade in the sound of digging in, shovels, commands being shouted. Then he'd cut it, let the silence hang. The Germans on the other side, their sound-ranging units, were listening to all of this. They were mapping it. They were reporting it. In their minds, this wasn't a couple of guys in a truck. This was 30,000 men preparing an attack. Ben felt like a god, maybe. A very nervous god. The illusion was visual. It was sonic, but it also had to be ethereal. In World War II, German intelligence was brilliant at radio interception. They didn't just listen to what was said, they listened to how it was said. Every radio operator has a unique fist, a hand. The Ghost Army's signal company learned to mimic them. They created fake radio networks, broadcasting phony orders, complaining about non-existent food, and discussing troop movements that were pure fiction. And finally, there was the atmosphere, the human element. This is where Jack Riley earned his stripes as an actor. He and his comrades would get their assignments. This week, you are the 75th Infantry Division. So they'd drive to the nearest town. They'd change the bumpers on their jeeps to have the 75th's markings. They'd sew their patches onto their shoulders. Then they'd go to the local cafe, order a coffee, and talk loudly. "Man, I hate this mud. Can't wait till we move out toward Aachen." They knew there were spies. They counted on it. They were putting on a play for an audience of one, the local German informant.
Inflatable tanks, a library of battle sounds, fake radio chatter, and amateur dramatics. This was the Ghost Army's toolkit. Their first major test came in August 1944, Operation Brest. The 23rd was tasked with simulating a massive force besieging the port city, allowing the real units to reposition. It was a chaotic, messy dress rehearsal, but it worked. The Germans held their position, firing on a phantom force, while the real Allied divisions slipped away. But the dress rehearsal was over. Patton was moving. The 70-mile gap was opening, and the 23rd was ordered to fill it. The operation was codenamed Bettenberg. It would be their most terrifying performance. September 22, 1944. The 1,100 men of the Ghost Army spread themselves impossibly thin across 70 miles of Luxembourg farmland and forest. They were impersonating two full armored divisions, the 4th and 6th, totaling over 30,000 men and hundreds of tanks. They had, in reality, a few dozen inflatable tanks and a handful of machine guns. For the first time, the 23rd was not simulating a front line. They were the front line, and that meant they were a target. For Ben Jacobs, that first night was different. This wasn't a game anymore. He was parked in a ravine, his sound truck and one half-track with a .50 cal. His team started the Armored Division Arriving program. The sound was immense. It echoed off the hills. It sounded so real they almost believed it. And then the Germans answered. German 88mm guns, artillery. They were firing at them, at their sounds. The shells were landing 500 yards away, walking right toward their position. Ben's driver was pale, but their orders were to keep playing the recording, to sell the illusion. Ben just kept his hand on the volume knob, his eyes on the tree line. That night, he realized, the better they were at their job, the more danger they were in. The Germans were probing. They sent patrols forward, skeptical of the massive new army that had appeared from nowhere. Jack Riley, guarding a battalion of rubber tanks, had his own encounter. It was just after dawn, fog everywhere. They had maybe 30 Shermans inflated in a clearing. They looked beautiful in the mist, real. And then they heard it, German voices. A patrol. Maybe 3 or 4 guys walking down the road 200 yards away. They stopped. They were looking right at them. Everyone froze. Their only real weapon was a machine gun on a jeep a quarter-mile away. The Germans just stared. You could see them talking, pointing. They were looking at an entire American tank battalion, and all the Americans had were air compressors. After what felt like an eternity, the German officer shook his head, and they turned back into the woods. They were too intimidated to even approach. They bought it. But the illusion was fragile. One afternoon, a German artillery shell, fired randomly, scored a direct hit. There was a whoosh and a bang. Jack's team hit the dirt. When the smoke cleared, they looked up. Shrapnel had torn through one of their M4s. It didn't explode. It just deflated. It flopped over on its side like a sad balloon. They all stared at it. Then their sergeant started yelling, "Get the patch kit! Get the patch kit! We've got a wounded tank!" They ran out there in broad daylight, in sight of the German lines, and started patching a bullet hole in a rubber tank. The absurdity was the only thing that kept them from going insane. For 8 days, 1,100 men held that 70-mile line. They played their records. They inflated their tanks. They lied in cafes. And the German High Command, convinced a massive force was digging in, diverted its resources. Patton's Third Army moved, undetected. The gap was closed by real divisions, and the 23rd vanished. They packed up their rubber tanks, unplugged their speakers, and slipped away in the night. They would stage 20 more deceptions, from the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest to the Battle of the Bulge, each one a masterpiece of misdirection. But they saved their greatest performance for last. March 1945. The Allies were at the edge of the Rhine River, the last natural barrier into the heart of Germany. The U.S. Ninth Army was preparing for a massive assault, Operation Flashpoint. The German command knew an attack was coming. They had fortified the riverbank, zeroed in their artillery, and positioned their best panzer divisions to repel any crossing. A direct assault would be a bloodbath. The Ghost Army was given its most audacious mission. They were to fake an entire Rhine River crossing, 10 miles south of the real objective. Their goal? Draw those panzer divisions away. The deception was codenamed Operation Viersen. This was not a small-scale illusion. This was a symphony. Viersen, as Ben Jacobs would later recall, was their masterpiece. They had every piece of the orchestra. It started at night. The 603rd moved in under darkness. Jack Riley and his team completed the biggest deployment they'd ever done. Over 600 inflatable tanks, cannons, trucks, and airplanes. They set up fake airfields, fake motor pools, fake headquarters. By dawn, from the air, it looked like 2 entire divisions had arrived at the river's edge. Then, Ben Jacobs' unit began its performance. They didn't just play tanks, they played construction. They had the sounds of bulldozers clearing roads. They had the sounds of pontoon bridges being assembled, the hammering, the shouting, the boats in the water. They played it all night, every night, right on the riverbank. They were daring the Germans to shoot at them. The spoof radio operators broadcast a blizzard of fake traffic, coordinating the invasion. Jack's unit created the atmosphere, driving trucks with their headlights on toward the river at night, but off when returning, creating the illusion of a massive supply chain. The Germans took the bait, completely. On the 3rd day, the shelling started. It was the heaviest barrage the 23rd had ever taken. The Germans threw everything at them, their artillery divisions, their rocket launchers. They shelled them for hours, and they were hitting rubber. They were wasting thousands of shells on air. Convinced that Viersen was the main assault point, the Germans moved. 2 full panzer divisions and several artillery battalions were rerouted, racing south to crush the Phantom Army. And as they did, 10 miles to the north, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, almost unopposed. Ben Jacobs heard it over the command net. Ninth Army is across. Minimal casualties. He just sat there in his sound truck. The German shells were still landing a mile away. They had done it. They had traded noise for lives. The Ninth Army's crossing was a stunning success. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, 1,100 men, had saved the lives of an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 of their brothers in arms. The war in Europe ended weeks later. The Ghost Army had staged 22 major deceptions. Their job was done. And then they were given their final order: disappear. The existence of the 23rd was immediately classified top secret. The men were debriefed, their records sealed, their unit histories locked away. They were ordered, under penalty of treason, to never speak of what they had done. They returned home, heroes without a story. Jack Riley returned to painting. His family knew he was in the engineers. They'd ask, "What did you do, Jack?" He'd say, "I painted trucks." He couldn't tell his wife. He couldn't tell his children as they grew up. For 50 years, the biggest, most important thing he had ever been a part of, officially, it didn't exist. His new canvases felt small. Ben Jacobs went back to the radio station, back to making sound effects for detective shows. People would talk about the war, about Patton, about the bulge. He'd just nod. He wanted to tell them, "You know that crossing at the Rhine? That was my record." But he couldn't. It was a strange, heavy silence. For 5 decades, the story of the Ghost Army remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. The men aged. They became fathers, grandfathers. They became famous artists like Ellsworth Kelly. They became designers like Bill Blass. They became photographers like Art Kane. And they all kept the secret. Until 1996, the files were finally declassified. The story broke. The surviving veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, could finally talk. Historians were stunned. The public was captivated. This wasn't just a story of military strategy, it was a story of human ingenuity. Jack Riley's son, a history teacher, called him, astonished. "Dad," he said, "you were an artist. You fought a war with art." Jack hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. They did. The legacy of the Ghost Army is not written on monuments. It is not measured in territory captured or enemies killed. Its legacy is in the battles that were not fought, in the soldiers who did come home, in the 30,000 lives saved by 1,100 men who wielded creativity as a weapon. They proved that sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield isn't the explosion, it's the idea. The most effective weapon isn't the bullet, it's the imagination. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Regiment of Rascals, the Masters of Deception. They were the Ghost Army.